welcome back to yet another one of your Re-Educated podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Suganya. She is a teacher and core team member at the Vidhyodaya Trust. I started my journey in India working here for 6 weeks, and I got to really fall in love with the area and the work that they do. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I hope you enjoy. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Quite nervous and excited for this conversation. So it's something new.
Yeah. It's hard to, I actually, when I got back, I had a few friends play the role of the host and I had to be on the other side. And it was very intimidating because I feel like it's not often where someone just asks you questions, right? Because usually it's a conversation, you get to say stuff, they get, but when there's like a clear, like, okay, I'm going to be the person being asked questions, it's a little intimidating. I definitely feel that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think the
Hope.
best way, yeah, it's like, yeah, something I'm trying to work on as well as a host of just like, how do you make somebody feel comfortable enough where like the nerves immediately stop to exist and then people just feel comfortable. But yeah, I hope I can do that this time. So I'm so excited to get into a lot of the work that you do. But
Yeah.
first, a question that I've been asking everyone is because some of my favorite parts about working with these organizations are the locations that they're actually in. I mean, the
Yeah.
location of this school and organ is so beautiful that for someone who can't imagine it, it would be hard to really appreciate it. So could
Yeah.
you paint a picture of what the area in Gudalur you work in looks like?
Um, I totally get it, right? Like it's a really beautiful location. So Gudalur is located near uh, it's it's in Nilgiris, which is a very important biodiverse region for the country, and it is a very important biodiverse region because it's completely it's rainforest area, especially where Gudlur is, and few kilometers above Gudlur, you have like a very different landscape, like grasslands, which is more closer to Ooty. But the entire region is has very different landscapes and has uh, like many living beings kind of coexisting in that space. But Gudlur especially is like very special because, as I said, it's near the rainforest, the Mudumalai uh, uh, forest, as well as if you go to the side of Kerala, they have the Nagarhole forest, and from Karnataka you have the Bandipur forest. So it's kind of nested right at the center where all these three forests kind of meet together, and that rear and there's mountains, the Nilgiri range around. So um, you can see like a lot of trees, birds, obviously, elephants, leopards, tigers, and the beautiful sky and the mountains. So that's the closest I can get to describing how
Yeah.
Gudalur looks. And the
And the
school is
rain.
yeah, and the
The
rain. Yeah,
rain is
I was getting
phenomenal.
to it. Yeah, it is a very wet region because I mean the rainforest has to sustain itself, and it rains 6 months in a year, kind of continuously in Gudlu, and yet there's no like waterlogging because it connects to the rivers which take its course. But that time it can get very damp, moist, depressing. But the rest of the time it's very beautiful and um, very grounding because there's just so many things happening around you very quietly.
Hmm. The one thing I remember, I mean, even as you say that, and it makes me feel like I'm there again, is every day I would run into a different species that I had no idea existed, and I would
Yeah,
be shocked. And the biodiversity and how rich it is of life is so amazing. I've never been around so much life that wasn't necessarily always humans. It
yeah,
was fascinating to have the boars and the dogs and the birds and
and the
just every.
flowers and the plants. Yeah, like
Mm.
Yeah,
Very
it's the
rich in
same.
life.
It's the same for me. Before I moved to Gudalur, even I came from a city, so it did take me a while to get accustomed to, and not just accustomed, but to also kind of appreciate this landscape. So it did take me a while, but I feel once you kind of really connect with it, it's very hard for you to not, appreciate it and want to nurture it. So
Hmm.
yeah, like
Fascinating. And so,
I have newfound appreciation for, like, okay, spiders and like these really creepy crawlies, and I'm like, okay, I can kind of, yeah, I'll maintain a distance without screaming. Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, and the frogs, and I felt I had never experienced, frogs in my bath, all of that with before, but once I was there, I fell kind of in love also with just like being like, all right, they're sure to hang out. Like, all right, let me scoot you out now. Like, it was the fear definitely goes down being there. I
Yeah.
would say that.
Yeah, but usually when we say, okay, Gudalur is in the Nilgiri range, usually people think about the vast grasslands and, the mountains and all. But you really come to this side, the landscape is completely different. And that for me is really fascinating in terms of just within few kilometers, how the entire landscape of the ecosystem changes. And it was a big learning for me as well when I moved here.
Hmm. And so one thing I'm fascinated by, and I'm really excited to get into this is, so the school itself, we can maybe start with the school and then get to the larger organization. But the foundation of the school itself is so beautiful. It's like nestled. It doesn't look like a building. Like when I first got to this place, I was like, is this just like a something that's built within the trees, or is this like, because usually when you think about a school, there's very structured buildings.
Yeah,
They look a certain way. There's classrooms. This structure, however, has no doors. I think there's only one door to enter
yeah,
it. And then after that,
yeah.
it's like a maze inside. And could you explain a little bit about the structure itself of the school? It's a phenomenal building or structure.
It's so design wise, the concept of the space that we are at really emphasizes on connection. So, like from one end of that space to the other end of that space, it needs to be connected and multiple entry points and exits without it feeling very directional, like the person kind of being in that space can decide how you kind of want to maneuver and navigate that space. So it's really it really flows in that manner. But a fun fact, this space that we are at was not designed for a school. So the space that we are at initially was the Adivasi hospital, and so some of the one of the rooms that we have is kind of like an eco room, but it used to be the operation theater with the the light and all of that and the dome. But this was not designed for it to be a school, but the hospital was also designed with the same concept in mind. And the idea being, how do we really make people feel, especially people from the Adivasi communities, feel comfortable in, like, how can the design of a space connect with people from the communities? And this kind of an architecture, at least not this big, but the materials used, the fact that there are not many doors, and like uh, and the fact that it's kind of connected uh, uh, was inspired from how people from within the communities use space and built their own spaces. And it worked for us for the school as well. And in fact, it was these two architects called Krishna Uncle and Anu Auntie who designed the space, and they are into alternate community based architecture. So we
Wow.
really lucked out with this school.
Yeah. I mean, I've never seen a structure with no doors where,
Mm,
like, one of my favorite parts was any student could at the very least see and know what's happening in the other grades. It
yeah,
wasn't like if you're in this standard, you can only see first standard. You can only see like, because typically schools are very roomed off, walled off, so you can only see what's happening perhaps in your grade, and maybe you can look
yeah,
through a window. But to actually have the space to be like, I can hear them, I can listen to them dance, I can listen to them talk, or it's a form of connection that you just will never get in a
Yeah.
walled off building. And I love that.
Yeah, and I feel that was also very deliberate, and it kind of really connects with the way we also think about the way children learn and the pedagogy. It
Mm,
like children do have that freedom to kind of choose the space that they want to go in, especially the younger children, the 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds who come to school the first time. They usually want to be with their brother or sister or someone who is a bit older from the same village, and you need to really encourage that for that child to really feel safe and nurtured in
mm,
that environment. And just the fact that okay, even the older kid can keep an eye out and the younger kid can also feel like okay, at any point of time I can go there without anyone giving me permission for it or not,
mm-hmm.
so um, children really appreciate that, and it's not like oh, children misuse it. I think they it really enables them to also contribute to that space and feel safe. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, now that you're talking about it, it was only there for the first time, working with Akanshka, who's like also working on an architect. She's an amazing architect. It only then started making me realize the importance of structure and intention
Mm,
in the design itself of how that actually leads to education. Because one thing that I'm also thinking of is when I'm in a room, for example, with really high ceilings, I also feel like my ideas and thoughts are sometimes able to also fill up that entire space. And
mm,
so while a school can't always have really tall buildings because that's just a lot of inefficient space, this one has a lot of space in the sense that your thoughts can expand sideways,
yeah,
like endlessly, right? I mean,
yeah,
there's no when you're running, for example. I mean, they play tag through the entire school. It's not just like, oh,
yeah.
you can only, it gives you space to run. I mean, yeah, I would love, I mean, to be in that space makes you have to rethink critically. Do schools have to look so structured? And this is one room, this is the next room. Does it have to be like that?
Yeah, I feel the way we think about a school and the way we visualize a school is so like connected to what we want education to do, right? Like,
Mm,
and how we even think about what about education, our own ideas of education, and it really kind of like if order and discipline is something that is very high up on your agenda and you say okay, this is what education is for, the kind of space that you're going to design is going to be a lot about how do you control, how do you order, how do you direct, right? With a lot of control, with a lot of authority on you. But if you're really thinking about children and like how children grow, and you really, really also as a person think about education as a pathway for freedom or like the experience of learning to be very joyful, I feel then how we think about the design of the school and the structure of the school is going to look very different. So it is all very interconnected, and a big challenge I feel for a lot of um, I mean educators or like school people who want to like run schools and all is or even governments for that matter. You've got buildings and you're like trying to change pedagogy, you're trying to like change everything else, but then the structure of the building remains the
mm.
same. So it does give a limitation, but I think we'll get to that point where people start looking at it as interconnected. And very recently, the government of India did explore this concept of Bala, like building as a learning aid.
Wow.
But then again, it was about okay, can we use the windows for measurement, can we use the angle of the door, like the sliding of the door to measure angles, but it was not looking at okay, the inner worlds of children and the kind of emotional connection that a space can bring about in people.
Wow, that's a very profound way of looking at architecture. The underlying philosophy of what education is impacts
Yeah.
the way the buildings themselves were. And then after that, the buildings themselves, regardless if you change pedagogy, like subconsciously enforces certain
Yeah.
beliefs.
Yeah.
That's a great, uh, very profound
Yeah.
statement. So you said something earlier, and now I want to kind of dive into this. But the word Adivasi,
Hmm.
what does that word mean?
Uh, it literally translates to first people. But the word Adivasi was kind of coined by people from the indigenous communities in India, but not so much here in Gudalur and the Nilgiris, but definitely in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan. Because as first people, like it's people like when the British came, they were known as the tribes, which continues to give off a very the perspective of them being backward or uncivilized or you know primitive. The word tribe, it carries those many connotations. So in the early years of the movement, the uh, Adivasi people from different communities preferred to be called this. But still, like if you look at the Northeast, they don't associate with the word Adivasi. They associate with the word tribe. So it's different, but generally, Adivasi means first people, and these are people who've got generations over generations over generations. Been here, been in that land, shared space with that land, have taken care of that ecosystem, and yeah, they are like it. That's what the word Adivasi means.
Hmm. You know, one thing that you said that I thought was interesting is in the US, when you think of indigenous, it's very clear who is and who isn't because most
Hmm.
people migrated at some point. So one thing I
Hmm.
thought that what was interesting is how do you distinguish who is indigenous and who is not when a lot of people in India have always been and lived there?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you asked me this question because recently I was reading a paper by this uh, person called research anthropologist called Gail Coelho, and she did her work, lived out of a so Better Kurumba is the name of one Adivasi community who is here. So she asked this essential question. She wanted to find out like how do you place indigeneity, and how do you say, okay, this group is indigenous and this group isn't. And it has got to do a lot with their practices, like their cultural practices. It has got to do a lot with their language. So she kind of gave instances where that particular community, Better Kurumba community, has language which clearly, has different words for settlers who had come. So, like, okay, for the Sri Lankan Tamils who got relocated here, they have a different term in their language. For the Tamils settlers, there's a very different term. For the Muslim settlers who had come, very different term. Even for the British, they have a very different uh, word in their language. So, just analyzing and looking at their language shows connection to that land, which probably other communities wouldn't have. And that's definitely one way in which you can place indigeneity for this particular location. The other one is also their cultural practices. Um, the kind of practices that they have for death, or the kind of practices that they have to kind of access their spirit world, or the kind of practices that they have for even their sustenance. It's very deeply connected to that landscape, and uh, without without that presence of that landscape, your practices don't exist. So um, that level of connection to land enables us to place to know who is indigenous and who isn't. Which right now I think like unless we mm, unless we look out for these things, it's very hard for it to come out. Like
Yeah.
it's not very easy in that sense because there's so many factors at play,
Hmm.
and mainly our stereotypes, right? Like
Yeah.
um uh okay, some of the, like, we do have, as a mainstream world, like we do have this thing of, okay, a lot of their practices are backward, they don't have a logic base to it or reason to it, and it's superstitious. But if you really kind of, okay, just accept that and go into how it emerged and how it's connected, we will see connections to land and which is not there for others.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even one that I thought was really interesting is when I would tell, this word Adivasi, it kind of brings about this feeling of unity. But when I was
Mhm.
there, every tribe spoke a different language, right? I mean, and
Yeah,
they
yeah,
all practiced so many,
yeah,
they weren't that similar, right? They
yeah,
were quite
yeah,
different from each other. And so even though the word makes you
yeah.
think they're
Yeah,
one,
it's like a double-edged sword, right? Like you really do want to build solidarity because like communities are like very few in number and they're so scattered across the region. So to kind of build solidarity for the movement, you need a language that is encompassing. But at the same time, there is so many differences within that group that if you don't also acknowledge it, then like, again, it's like standardization happening even at that end. So
yeah.
here there are four different, no, like in Gudalur, Pandalur, there are five different Adivasi communities. The Paniyas, the Betukurumbas, the Katnaikas, the Mullakurumbas, and the Irulas. And you go further, you go near Ooty and all, then there are a completely different group of, Adivasis there. So acknowledging the heterogeneity and the also hence the differences in their own practices is very important. And in fact, it was only like the Paniyas don't refer to them as Adivasis. Like the Paniyas call them Paniyas or the Betukurumbas call them Betukurumbas. It was only because of the Adivasi Munetra Sangam here where they had to get these different communities together to fight for land rights. And we had to really come together, and we come together in our shared experience of being an Adivasi. The term
Hmm.
Adivasi was also something that was brought in here, but um, if like even elsewhere, they first identified themselves as their own community and then connect to the idea of being an Adivasi.
Hmm. And so one thing that you brought up is you said the school, Vidhyodaya, is an Adivasi school, right? And so one question I have is, what is, and this is a longer discussion, which I'm excited to get into now, but what would you say are some of the differences that makes Vidhyodaya different from, for example, the local government schools that does make it an Adivasi school?
Mm. Um, the origins of the school in itself, the idea that, okay, there needs to be a school for the children for the Adivasi communities in itself, um, determines whether, okay, like is a big differentiating factor because the foundational ideas of the school really emerged from very, very discriminatory experiences that the children faced in other schools. So they back then they were community leaders, the then community leaders who were part of this collective called the Adivasi Munetra Sangam decided they really needed a school for their children. And then began the discussion, okay, if we say we want a school for our own children, how, what is it that we are expecting out of education, or what is it that we are expecting out of the school for our children? So there, one of a big difference comes is, over here there is really a big sense of pride of being an Adivasi, and this, even for me who's a non-Adivasi, to enter this space means I do a lot of unlearning and learn to really respect uh, uh, people from Adivasi communities. So the sense of pride, which is kind of brought about by incorporating their history, their culture, and when I say culture, their songs, their language, their dance, their practices, their people, most importantly, their people into that space in itself really differentiates other government schools or other schools to Vidhyodaya. Because we cannot talk about education in schools without talking about who are these people making decisions for children, and who are these people, you know, thinking about what education should look like. And for so many years, and even till today, you won't find um, Adivasis in those spaces. And it really matters that, especially for communities that have a history of knowledge, abundance, and also history of, marginalization, to really have those people be in the spaces of power to decide what should education look like and do for themselves and their children. So the fact that at Vidyodaya we have um, Adivasi teachers, and predominantly they are Adivasi teachers, and the way the culture and the context of the Adivasi communities are brought into the school, be it through the freedom to really use the language and speak in the language, and the reference to what they see around. Like, if you're taking a topic on food, what kind of food you want to kind of highlight in your lesson looks very different when you have an Adivasi teacher there. And
Hmm.
right from there to also the pedagogy, there's a lot of emphasis on group learning and cooperation. And this was not something that the early founders of the school had to bring in intentionally, right? Like, it was something that was already present, and it was very important for the school to allow for that, and not let that go. Now we see people around, educators around, talking about how cooperative learning is very important and how peer learning is important, and this was something that always existed in these communities. So at Vidyodaya, the pedagogy is definitely group based. How decisions are made are non hierarchical. Um, People actually come together, including children, come together to either have a say, have a buy in to a decision, or not have a buy in to a decision. And there's no visible markers of power in the school. There's no school leader's office. There's no a separate table for the teacher and a separate table for children. um, we all sit on the floor and learn together. These might come across as very subtle things, but I think they all kind of really connect to each other, and uh, also really value the strengths existing within the communities and leverage that for learning.
Hmm.
So I would say these really make it very different when we look at a government school or another private school, and when we say, okay, Vidyodaya is an Adivasi school.
Hmm. And one of the things I think that was most evident to me is that all the teachers there cared deeply about the children. There was no, this is someone else's kid. It was very like, this is one family. Everybody is important here. And that belief itself is very unique. You're not going to find that in every school. And that's hard to cultivate. So one question I have for you is, we were talking earlier about how each group, each tribe in the Adivasi community is so different. And so, how is it that you're able to come up with a curriculum that serves all of them when there are a lot of differences?
Mm, it is a constant, like, I want to share that this is a constant like we strive for it constantly every single day. So it's not that okay, we've reached that space, but definitely having teachers from different communities really help, because very basic, it really enables the fact that okay, we can speak four different languages in the same space. What also happens is the teachers also try to learn certain, I wouldn't say very basic, but quite a good amount of language of the different communities that's really needed to connect with the child. And that effort really brings about that connection and makes that space accessible for every child, irrespective of which community that they come from. And because the school is kind of connected to Adivasi Munnetra Sangam and others, Accord and Ashwini, where there are also other people who are from different communities working not on education but probably on other different things. So there is a connection between the teachers at the school, the people working at school, and people there as well. So if there's something that we do want to know about um, the Katnaika community, and we don't have those many teachers, we actually have people from the Katnaika community come to the school, and we through these networks and connections with our sister organizations, and they come to the school and they share their experience, and that kind of experience is curated.
Hmm.
So the school is not really cut off from the other happenings in the community. Uh, so if we do want to have, if we want to learn better Kurumba songs, we do have access through the Adivasi Munnetra Sangam to a better Kurumba elder or few better Kurumba older women in the community. And we can make that effort to go and learn from them. And they also relate to that space because they see the space as it's their school. So
Hmm.
they also they're also willing to come to that space. Um, so these are small ways in which we try to ensure that the school is also kind of connected to the different communities. And uh, as teachers, as educators, we also try to learn about different communities and what is different, and what is unique, and really try to connect it uh, to the learning process as well. And it
Yeah.
is not very different when you think of the role of the teacher as okay, how do you really connect learning to the context of the child? And even if the children all come from the same community, the context of the child is going to look very different. So the process that the
Hmm.
teacher hence takes is not so different. Like you still, to make learning meaningful, you still have to connect it to the context of the child. And hence the question is, what efforts are you taking to understand the context of the child? And the fact that the school is in this ecosystem enables that for the teacher as well.
Hmm. One thing I
but
want to
but
understand
it's
it.
challenging, like it is challenging. And um it is something that we are also constantly trying to be better at and do better at.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I do want to understand is, and I've all the alternative education systems that I've seen or been part of, I see that they have this challenge, and it's that their end of the goal eventually kind of leads them back into the mainstream education system at some point. So no matter how long you're in this alternative system, eventually you are kind of channeled back into the mainstream. And I found that in a lot of places that's very difficult. A lot of times you're educated in a certain way, you fall in love with certain types of learning, and then all of a sudden it changes, right? I mean, corporal punishment. I mean, the list goes on things that can
Yeah.
change drastically. How have you seen that impact the students who go from an Adivasi school where they're learning in this kind of loving nature and environment, and then they kind of move back into the government schools where they no longer feel or know that connection with the teacher and all of those things? How does that impact the child?
It does impact the child a lot. There's no There's no doubt there. And it does impact the growth, the well-being of the child there, and every other child there. Even if you're a child who've been in that mainstream from day one, it is impacting that child as well. But this transition definitely is difficult for the children. But I think the key question for us to ask is, when is that transition happening? Like right now, Vidyoya school is only till grade 5. That means it's only working with children till age 10 or 11, which is like they're just starting to become, adolescent children. They're still like children and kids and not adolescent children. But earlier, Vidyodaya was working with children till 15 years and 16 years, right? And the way in which those children were able to make the transition, and the way in which 11, 12, 10, 11 year olds are making the transition looks very different. And um, what we've also kind of, I mean, I've not seen, because I've been here only when Vidyodaya, where Vidyodaya has been only till grade 5, but we discuss about this a lot within our team also, is that older children are able to be ready for that transition to happen. Like they feel that, okay, there is some sense of control and there is reasoning. They do feel they can access few people, access support systems, which makes that transition a bit easier. And also, the end of the day, the society is not changing, right? Like the way in which things work at the broader societal level is also not changing for them. But at the end of the day, this kind of a learning approach instills that sense of pride, instills that sense of confidence and the autonomy to take what they want and not take what they want. In one of our conversations with an alumni who is around 20, 26 years old now, and he's working with another organization, and we are like, we also be in touch with them, and we asked them like, how did this happen for you? And he had completed till grade 10 at Vidyodaya. And he said initially it was difficult because he was getting mocked at for speaking his language, which he's never experienced at Vidyodaya, right? And and then he said he had few people here who he could come and talk to about it. But without even that, he was like, he said he spoke to himself and he said, okay, they are mocking me because I'm speaking this language, but I know four languages. I know English, Tamil, Malayalam, and my own language, and probably a little bit of Hindi as well. But they only know two languages. So why should I accept that coming at me?
Hmm.
So he said after that it didn't affect him. So the transition is difficult. All it's the goal of the school is not to, the school can't change, the larger society immediately, but it can really prepare you to have that autonomy and build that sense of reasoning within you, that in turn enables you to navigate the world without losing the sense of who you are. But right now, of course, children are finding it very difficult because they're transitioning when they are 10 years old and 11 years old, like
Hmm.
it is challenging for them. We try our level best to follow up with them, and the school is also connected to another program. We have a residential learning space. So this is essentially, there is a need for the children to continue to be in this kind of an environment, and we have a residential learning space um, for that. And essentially, because of this gap, we are expanding our school. Like we've purchased land, and we are looking at constructing a bigger campus so that we can have children till grade 10.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I have this question for you, and I'm curious to hear your answer. So, as a first generation, I guess second, I don't know how it technically works. I guess I could consider myself a first generation immigrant. I know a lot of people who have similar experiences to me as they grow up have to figure out, okay, to what extent are they going to conform to the larger society, and to what extent are they going to continue the culture that they practice at home. So for example, a lot of kids will have had the experience of bringing, for example, Indian food to school, having
Mm.
someone make fun of that, and then they eventually switch over to sandwiches or whatever. Or they may dress a certain way, and then after a certain point that's ridiculed. And there's a whole list, a laundry list of things that you may have originally done that, I don't know, wear vibhuti to school, which is the white powder
Yeah.
that and there's a whole list of things that you may have done or wanted to continue in your culture, but you have to let go of to fit into the larger culture. My question is to what extent do you find that to be ineffective, and what part of that do you just find to be how cultures work? I mean, a lot of times it seems that societies are built to not deal with too much heterogeneity, because if everyone is too different, there's no shared values to kind of build together
Yeah.
on, right? But it's a little more complex in that way, where it's like, by continuing a smaller community's principles and values, you do also make it more difficult to fit into the larger community.
Um. Uh, it's not like, okay, I'm it's hard for me to articulate because whenever we talk about culture, there is always this question that comes to me: what about your culture? How are you practicing your culture? Like, look at you, you're wearing pant and shirt, and uh like, you're not practicing your culture. So I get that question at me. So I've kind of thought about this question a lot. um, and I feel like, um, when we say culture, it's when I say culture, and when I say, oh, culture is important for people from marginalized communities, I am talking about identities as well, and a sense of connection to who you are. I'm not only talking about what the practices are, or how they dress, or what they do, which can change. I feel in the age of modernity, and with capitalism working so well, no cultures are immune to the those changes. But there are some practices which all cultures, really hang on to, which might not be very visible from the outside, but which are so visible, which are so felt within you. How the From where you get your sense of belonging, from where you get a sense of security or connection. And if for a marginalized group, uh, the what do I say? Just the acceptance of that group is a challenge, like
Hmm.
especially for Adivasi communities. Like, you're not supposed to be an Adivasi. You're not supposed to be that way, and that's accepted. They have to change. So that so there is a power dynamic within cultures at play. So on one hand, um, we cannot, talk about cultures and this identity without talking about power dynamics and structural inequities across different communities. If the existence of certain practices um, is looked at as backward, is looked at as primitive, is looked at as superstitious, whereas from your positionality, but whereas from their positionality, it is completely different. And you find ways to control that, you find ways to shame it, you find ways to ridicule it. The sense of belonging and that sense of identity for that child and for that young person at the end of the day is I mean, it leaves you in a very, very, very difficult space. And no education is neutral. Every education is either promoting a culture or taking away from a culture. No education is neutral. So, how do you, how do we then say it's okay if cultures change? It's important that a child knows science, math, has good grades, and is able to get a job. These are, I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's, um, especially for the Adivasi communities, a modern education or schooling which works for other communities is taking away from who they are and what they think of themselves.
Hmm.
And that is like, it's it's not just.
Hmm.
When other people from other cultures have spaces to have that sense of belonging, right? You have temples, you have markers as cultural spaces, and you have the choice to go to it. You have scriptures, you have so many places that, okay, even if you are in this world, you still have those pathways that lead you back to some elements of your culture. But for a lot of groups, you don't. The society has taken that away.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess like what I'd be interested to see is an example of where, because irrespective of what country, every area will have a dominant culture just because a majority of people follow or believe a certain thing versus another, unless it was somehow like perfectly split equally, um, which I find to be difficult. Like,
Yeah,
right, there
I think the
would.
idea the idea is here to not always say, this is who I am and this is who I will always be, but just having, and creating that space for different cultures to coexist, while constantly also striving for some common human values. Like, at one point of time, you also got to move away from your certain identities to come together as people in
Mm-hmm.
society. So the idea is to not always stick to these identities, right? The idea is to, yes, acknowledge that these exist, acknowledge that lived experience, and create those spaces. And yet, with the goal of being, okay, what kind of shared values do we also live by? And if some of those values are there in your culture, great. If some of the values are not there in your culture, do you have the ability to learn for your own good, not at the
Mm.
cost of what you already know and what you have a connection with?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing I want to ask you, and I feel like there are a lot of people I've met as of late who want to help and who want to kind of do their best and throughout their life to give to others, and regardless of what point in their life they're in. And I feel like you've lived with this community, you worked with Adivasi communities for a few years now. And I'm curious to understand, and from your understanding and your
Positionality.
conversations with a lot of people in that area, when you think of what it means to help this community, what does that look like to you? What does it mean for the Adivasi community to better, what's a better situation for them?
I um I hmm. It's not for me to say what is a better situation for them. Like, I but definitely, like, in working together with the people there, like, definitely the better situation is just the availability of opportunities, for them to choose from, to feel supported, to feel nurtured, their rights being uh, uh, functioning, for the lack of better word, and their culture to still be practiced. I think these are from what I can gather, these are very, very important for them, and this definitely means a better situation for them, and to help the community I don't know if I'm helping the community, because I feel like I'm helping myself by being here. So it might sound very cliche, but I mean, for me, it's not. It's very deeply personal. We are both people from the community and me are both on a transformational journey. So as much as we try to change the the some things that are outside, we're also changing within. And that I feel is very important for not only people working with Adivasi communities. I feel like people working with marginalized people and communities, because then you are also connecting with the struggle, you are also connecting with the pain. Change is not easy, and you're also open to change yourself, and not really coming from this pedestal saying, I know everything, and I'll teach you, or that kind of a savior uh, mindset, which in turn re-emphasizes the very structural things that we are trying to change. So yeah.
Yeah. It's because I think one of the things I'm curious about your answer is in terms of, are there other, like, so for example, I know the trust works in a lot of the organizations there. There's a healthcare plan. I mean, there's there's an entire hospital, there's entire transportation. In terms of like necessities, or in terms of, do you find that there's a need of assistance there, or are most basic
Of course.
necessities of?
No, like if we just go, like in India and not just here, malnutrition is high among children in Adivasi communities. Housing is in such a poor state. There are no good houses that they are actually living in. Water supply, electricity supply. These are all everyday challenges that they are living with. And we've just for the basic in, I mean, I always get uh, kind of taken aback by this word basic, because it doesn't feel like basic here. It feels like, oh, it's big thing. But these very essential needs are still not met
Hmm.
for a lot of communities. And you can choose to look at it as particularly as like, okay, this is a health issue or this is like an infrastructure issue, but essentially like, all these are intersectional, interconnected, and it essentially really boils down to rights and how we view that community and how we don't.
Hmm. And just for a little bit of context, how do you think, was that always the case, or is that something that's happened as of late?
So uh malnutrition, housing issues, water issues, electricity issues, all of these issues have emerged only after the communities have been evicted from their land, which earlier they were in the forest. But with forests being declared as reserve forests, with settlers coming into the region, with them being pushed to the margins, and finally, you don't have access to that way of life. And then you come out where your knowledge doesn't have space here, and you are at the mercy of powerful people or the government. And the way they think about nutrition, the way they think about housing, the way they think about um, uh, uh, infrastructure is so very different, well, compared to what the people need. And that is why these problems exist. And it's not a very recent thing. It's been there for the last 15-20 years. When I go to the villages, like it's taken 8 years for people to get a house, which is not a big house, by the way. It's like one room and one hall, and that's about it, like a matchbox. 8 years. So I mean, yeah,
Yeah. And so have you found the organization and the kids who are going through the Vidyodaya school and are enriched by all the different organizations, or have you seen
yeah,
kind of a lot of these problems being dealt with?
definitely. Um, just the fact that a lot of these problems are getting visibilized and taken to the people who are supposed to be held accountable is only because of, I think, these institutions and the work the institutions and along with the Adivasi Monitor Sangam continue to do. And else they wouldn't. Else they won't, because it's very easy to invisibilize these problems and live with it, right? So
Hmm.
fact that uh, these problems are getting visibilized and people are approaching the district offices, the collectorate offices, the state government, the people themselves, is in itself efforts being taken to really improve the situation. And also, we have to also think about the psychology as well and the behavior, like for the people from within the communities to feel that sense of strength and to actually question or to problematize things. It doesn't come very easily for anyone, not only for these communities. So just the fact that people have been able to feel a sense of strength is only because of the fact that, okay, these institutions and this ecosystem which exists.
Hmm.
And and even issues like, okay, there's a fight between families, or like more interpersonal issues like that, people resolve these, people do approach these spaces. So there's that amount of trust, and it's definitely changed. um it has moved the needle forward, but are we there yet? No.
Hmm. And so what are you looking forward to for the future of these
A
for
lot of
Vidyodaya?
things, like definitely really looking forward to um moving to a new campus, like not just moving, I feel like constructing the new campus, because again we are going through this exercise of how do we want the school to look like, and going back to these conversations of, okay, what do we want education to do, and how do we want our children to learn, and how do we want to learn and contribute. So the fact that we are revisiting these conversations and kind of drawing the principles from there, and hence designing that space in itself is a very exciting process. That's something that we're really looking forward to. And uh, we have new teachers, young people from the community join as teachers, and that is personally giving me a lot of energy and excitement, because you know it really matters, and it shows that, okay, the space is still relevant even today, when young people from the community want to do this for themselves and their children. um, and also really strengthening the connection of the school and the larger communities, the villages, because as a school you would probably only we would be able to reach out only to few limited children, but by design, like that's a limitation that we all have to accept as a school. But the principles and the ethos of the school, the concept of the school is like, okay, the school has to also, like, it's a unit nested within the larger community. So how do we really strengthen those connections and support each other, is like creating those pathways and putting in energies in those pathways is also something that's really exciting.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm realizing now that change is only seen over an extended period of time. It doesn't happen very quickly. And so to have the patience and to put in the effort year after year after year, you finally get to see it blossom, decades down the line. And so
Yeah,
it's a beautiful journey and process, and it's amazing work that you guys do. So I'm definitely excited to share the word and
yeah,
see what else can happen.
yeah, thank you. Really,
Yeah.
thank you. I feel like it's true. In fact, like moving to this bigger campus was a 30-year dream. We started thinking and planning for it 30 years before, and for it to happen now, I mean, it says a lot about how change works. And it is like, I like, a lot of people ask us, what does success look like? And yeah, we do need to have some process indicators and some checkpoints that show us whether we are on the path or not. But we'll really know if it is a success or not only over a period of time. And we've really got to be patient. And more than being patient, I feel like I am also learning to have faith in this
Mm,
manner, which is, I feel, is also very equally important, and not just patience.
yeah. You have to believe.
Yeah, like that faith is, that belief is fundamental.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing everything today. Today was a lovely conversation.
Yeah, same here. I mean, it was not so difficult as I
Yeah.
thought it would be. And
I'm
I
glad.
enjoyed it as well. And I mean, I'm really glad that I showed up for this conversation and didn't pass it on for someone else because of my nerves kicked in. But I'm glad this happened. It enabled me to also think for myself. So thank you for those thoughtful questions.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you again for listening and making this process so much more enjoyable. If you haven't had the chance to already, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Google, and Apple Podcasts to get the latest updates on new episodes. If you've been learning useful information here, feel free to leave a review as well. A little bit goes a long way in spreading this podcast. And have a wonderful day. And as per usual, stay re-educated.